The air that day carried the sweet rot of peach blossoms and the sharper bite of human sweat when they marched him up the wooden steps beside the new railroad depot. 1,000 people pressed shoulder to shoulder under a white spring sky, yet the moment the auctioneer cracked his whip for silence, the only sound left was the breathing of women. The morning of April 17, 1850 broke hot and windless, the kind of heat that made even the dogs lie flat in the shade and pant like they'd already run 10 miles. By 9 o'clock the dirt around the new railroad depot had turned to powder, rising in little ghosts every time a boot or a hoopskirt disturbed it. Word had traveled up from the coast and down from the mountains that something extraordinary was coming off the train from Savannah. One man, 22 years old, no scars on his back, no brand, no history of running, and a face the trader swore could stop a preacher mid-sermon. People began gathering before the sun cleared the treetops. Farmers left plows in the furrow. Shop clerks locked their doors. Ladies who never set foot outdoors without parasols and 3 petticoats arrived veiled in black lace as though attending a funeral, though their eyes behind the netting were bright and ravenous. By the time the locomotive hissed into the station, the platform was packed so tight that latecomers had to stand on crates or cling to the sides of wagons just to see. They brought him out last, after the cooks and the nursemaids and the boys barely old enough to lift a hoe. 2 guards marched ahead with rifles, 2 behind, though the chains on his ankles were light enough that he barely dragged them. When he stepped into the sunlight, the crowd inhaled as one body. A woman near the front, Mrs. Ezekiel Rawls, wife of the biggest cotton factor in Fulton County, actually swayed and had to be held upright by her husband's elbow. No one laughed. No one catcalled. The usual coarse banter that greeted slave auctions died in every throat. He mounted the low block without being shoved. The wood creaked once under his weight and then was still. Sunlight slid across the planes of his face like water over obsidian, cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper, a mouth shaped as though an angel had pressed a thumb there while the clay was wet, eyes the color of heart blood held up to a lamp. His shirt had been taken from him on the train, so there was nothing to hide the long, clean lines of his torso. The way muscle shifted under dark skin moved like something alive and separate from bone. Someone in the back whispered, "Lord Jesus," and it was impossible to tell if it was prayer or curse. Auctioneer Coker climbed up beside him, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief already soaked through. Coker had sold twins, fancy girls with skin light enough to pass, iron-hard field hands who could pick 600 pounds before dinner, but he had never sold anything like this. His voice cracked twice before he got the first word out. "Gentlemen and ladies, lot number 47, name of Silas, age 22, guaranteed sound in wind and limb, no blemish-free, raised on a small place near Darien, skilled in house service." A hand shot up before he finished. $500 from Colonel Hargrove, who everyone knew had sworn never to buy another slave after his wife died. Another hand. 1,000 from Mr. Lowndes the banker, bidding for his own money for the first time in 20 years. The numbers leapt like sparks off flint. 1,500. 2,000. 2,500. Women who had never spoken above a murmur in church leaned forward and hissed figures to the men beside them. Daughters tugged at Father's coat sleeves. A bride of 3 weeks, still wearing orange blossoms in her hair, lifted her husband's arm herself and forced his placard into the air. Coker's gavel hovered, forgotten. Sweat rolled off his chin and spattered the pages of his ledger. At 4,000 a scuffle broke out near the front when Mrs. Amos Calloway tried to climb onto the platform itself. Her brother dragged her back by the waist, but not before she had stretched out both gloved hands toward the block as though the men standing there were already hers by right of longing. The price kept climbing. 6,000. 7,500. Men who had come only to watch began bidding against their will to dig banknotes from their pockets, driven by something hotter than reason. Mothers bid against their own sons-in-law. A widow in mourning silk who had not left her house in 2 years stood on a barrel and screamed $8,000 in a voice raw as a crow's. When Judge Harlan Whitfield, 71 years old, face carved deep as a hatchet, owner of 3 plantations and half the lots on Peachtree Street, raised his cane and croaked 9,000, the crowd finally fell silent, stunned that any man would pay a king's ransom for flesh. Coker brought the gavel down so hard the handle cracked. Sold. To Judge Harlan Whitfield for $9,200. The sound that followed was not the usual cheer but something lower, almost a sob, as though the city itself had been wounded and did not yet know if the cut would heal or fester. Silas Vale never changed expression. He looked once, slowly, across the sea of white faces turned toward him, some pale with fury, some flushed with triumph, many wet with tears they could not explain, and then he lowered his head again, the picture of perfect servitude. Only someone standing very close might have noticed the faint curve at the corner of his mouth, the barest suggestion of amusement, as if he had just heard a joke no one else in Georgia would understand for many months to come. The guards moved to lead him away. As the chains chimed softly against the wood, Mrs. Rawls broke free of her husband's grip and lunged forward, clawing the air. She did not reach him. But her glove, torn loose in the struggle, fluttered to the ground at Silas's feet like a white flag already surrendered. No one who was there that day ever forgot the weight of the silence that followed, thick as summer thunder waiting to break over the red clay hills. They only knew, though they could not have said how, that something irrevocable had stepped off the train with that man, something that wore beauty like a weapon and moved through the crowd the way plague moves through breath. And Atlanta, still proud in its infancy, still certain that money and bloodlines could buy anything under heaven, began, without a single shot fired or law broken, the long, exquisite unraveling of itself. The Whitfield mansion stood 3 stories tall on the crest of Peachtree Hill, white columns gleaming like ribs against the dark green of magnolia leaves. When the carriage rolled through the gates at dusk on the day of the sale, every lamp in the house was already lit, though no one could remember who gave the order. Servants lined the drive in 2 silent rows, eyes lowered, yet every head turned a fraction as Silas stepped down. The judge's overseer reached for the chain between his ankles, but Silas lifted one foot and then the other with such calm courtesy that the men let the iron fall unused into the dust. Inside, the air was thick with beeswax and old money. Portraits of dead Whitfield stared down from the stairwell, their painted eyes following the new purchase as he was led across black and white marble. Judge Whitfield himself had taken to his bed with a sick headache brought on by the auction. The bidding had cost him more than land and cotton combined, and the knowledge sat on his chest like a stone. So it was the women who waited in the wide central hall, Mrs. Evelyn Whitfield, 43, still handsome in the way winter roses are handsome, her daughters Clara, 19, and Louisa, 17, both pale copies of their mother, and the judge's widowed sister-in-law, Miss Letitia Gray, who had come from Charleston the previous winter and never quite left. They stood in a half-circle beneath the chandelier, 4 sets of gloved hands clasped so tightly the kidskin squeaked. Silas stopped when the housekeeper told him to stop. He did not look up, yet the women felt seen in a way that made their throats close. Mrs. Whitfield recovered first, lifting her chin the way she did when addressing the Ladies' Benevolent Society. "You will serve in the house," she said, voice thin but steady. "You will speak when spoken to. You will keep your eyes on your work. Dukins will show you your quarters above the laundry." Silas inclined his head, the movement slow, almost regal. When he passed them on his way to the back stairs, the scent that drifted from his skin, something like crushed and green, like mint left too long in the sun, made Clara press her palm to her collarbone as though to still a suddenly frantic heart. That first night he was given a pallet in the narrow room over the wash-house. The other house servants, curious and wary, waited until the lamps were out before they crept close. They found him sitting cross-legged on the bare boards, eyes open, staring at nothing. When old Caesar asked his name, he answered softly, "Silas Vale," and the sound of it rolled through the room like distant thunder over water. After that, no one asked anything else. They simply lay down and pretended to sleep while listening to him breathe, slow and even, as though the night belonged to him more than to them. In the morning he rose before the roosters and carried water, polished silver, beat carpets until the dust rose in golden clouds. He moved through the house like a shadow that had learned perfect manners. Yet everywhere he went, time seemed to thicken. A maid lifting a tureen would pause mid-step and forget what she carried. Footmen found themselves staring at the play of muscle along his arms while he split kindling. And the women of the family, God help them, began to invent reasons to pass through whatever room he occupied. Mrs. Whitfield took to reading her Bible in the back parlor at the precise hour Silas blacked the stoves. Clara practiced piano scales that grew slower and dreamier whenever his footsteps sounded in the hall. Louisa carried bouquets from the garden and lingered by the cutting table long after the flowers were arranged, watching his hands strip thorns with a single twist. Miss Letitia, who had not smiled since her husband drowned off Sullivan's Island, began taking her afternoon coffee on the side porch where Silas swept the leaves each day at 3. He never touched them. He barely spoke. When Mrs. Whitfield asked if he could read, he answered, "Some, ma'am," in a voice low enough to bruise the air. When Clara dropped her hymnal and he retrieved it, his fingers brushed hers for the length of a heartbeat and she felt the touch travel straight to the base of her spine like warm brandy. When Louisa spilled milk across the breakfast table and he knelt instantly with a cloth, her knees buckled and only the table edge kept her upright. Miss Letitia once met his eyes across the laundry yard and felt something inside her chest tear open with a sound she was glad no one else could hear. 6 weeks passed like that, quiet, deadly. The house grew heavy with unsaid things. The judge, still recovering from his headache, noticed nothing except that his women laughed too often and too softly, the way women laugh when they are keeping a delicious secret. Then, one by one, the bleeding stopped. First Miss Letitia, who had not conceived since her wedding trip 10 years earlier. Then Clara, then Louisa, and finally Mrs. Whitfield herself, whose courses had been as regular as the moon since girlhood. They did not confess, not yet. They simply began to glow, the way lanterns glow when the wick has been trimmed and the glass wiped clean. Their skin took on the sheen of pearls. Their eyes grew luminous and slightly unfocused, as though they were listening to music no one else could hear. And every evening, when the house settled and the judge snored behind his closed door, one of them, sometimes two, sometimes all four on nights when thunder rolled over the red clay hills, would drift down the back stairs in her night trail, barefoot, hair unbound, drawn by the low sound of Silas humming in the wash house, a tune none of them recognized yet all of them somehow remembered from before they were born. He never forced no one. He asked for nothing. He simply waited, patient as the river that carved the valley, while the women of the Whitfield house came to him one by one and offered everything they had been taught never to give. And in the hush between lightning and thunder, in the scent of lye soap and moonflowers and skin, the oldest laws of Georgia began, very quietly, to break. The first public crack appeared on a Sunday in early July, when the heat pressed down so hard the tar between the bricks on Whitehall Street bubbled like molasses. Second Baptist on Pryor Street was packed tighter than a seed tick, fans fluttering like white moths above every pew. The women of Atlanta had come dressed in their lightest muslins, but the air inside the sanctuary felt thick enough to chew. Reverend Mr. Pritchard was midway through a thunderous sermon on the wages of secret sin when Mrs. Ezekiel Rawls rose from her seat near the front, both hands pressed to the swell beneath her bodice, and began to weep in a way that had nothing to do with repentance. She did not scream. She simply opened her mouth and let the tears roll, great silent floods that soaked the lace at her throat. Then, in a voice so soft the people 3 rows back had to lean forward to hear, she said, "His name is Silas Vale, and he is the father of the child I carry." 1,000 fans stopped moving at once. Mr. Rawls, red-faced and prosperous, half stood as though someone had shoved a bayonet against his spine. Around him, other women began to tremble. Miss Letitia Gray, seated with the Whitfield party, went the color of tallow. Clara Whitfield clutched her sister's arm so hard the lace tore. Louisa stared straight ahead, lips parted, eyes shining like someone listening to a hymn only she could hear. Reverend Pritchard tried to call for order, but his voice cracked like a green stick. Before he could find it again, Mrs. Amos Calloway stood up in the 4th pew and repeated the same words, almost dreamily, "Silas Vale." Then the governor's niece, Miss Susanna Bullock, visiting from Milledgeville, rose on shaky legs and whispered it too. Within minutes the names rippled outward in widening circles, the daughter of the cotton broker McKendry, the young wife of Circuit Judge Collier, the spinster schoolteacher who boarded at Mrs. Hargrove's, even the mulatto seamstress everyone pretended was Spanish, all of them touching their bellies or their throats and breathing that one impossible name. Men looked at one another in animal confusion. Some reached for wives who shrank from their hands. Others stared at daughters whose eyes had gone strange and distant. The church filled with the rustle of bombazine and the low, rising hum of women crying without sound. No one threw a punch, no one shouted, the horror was too refined for that. It simply settled over the congregation like yellow dust, choking every throat. By the time the deacons managed to clear the aisles, 27 women had spoken or been spoken for. 27 white women of property and position, every one of them carrying a child whose father, they swore through tears of terrifying joy, was the same silent house servant lately bought by Judge Whitfield for $9,000. Word traveled faster than fire in pine straw. Carriages raced up Peachtree and down Marietta Road, drivers whipping horses to lather. Men gathered on street corners in the blistering sun, hats in their hands, faces the color of old ash. In the cool back rooms of dry goods stores and law offices, in the shaded galleries of plantation houses 20 miles out, the same conversation repeated itself in shaken voices. How many months along? 3, maybe 4. And she says it's the same nigger. She swears it. They all swear it. But he never forced. That's just it. They say he never laid a hand on them unless they asked. And Lord help us, they asked. Engagements were broken before supper. One groom-to-be put a pistol in his mouth behind the livery stable on Decatur Street. The bullet only took off his jaw and left him screaming. Another rode out of town at dusk and was never seen in Georgia again. Fathers locked daughters in upstairs rooms, only to find the girls weeping at the windows, palms pressed to the glass, calling a name their fathers could not beat out of them. Mothers who had spent years arranging matches worth tens of thousands in land and slaves watched those contracts burn to nothing in a single afternoon. At the Whitfield place the judge sat alone in his study with the doors barred, a loaded shotgun across his knees and a decanter of bourbon sweating beside his elbow. Upstairs, his wife and daughters moved from room to room like ghosts, humming that low, tuneless song Silas hummed while he worked. When the judge demanded answers, Mrs. Whitfield only touched her belly, still flat enough to hide beneath wide skirts, and smiled the small, secret smile of a woman who has already stepped off the edge of the world and found she can fly. Outside, Atlanta's finest families began to discover that bloodlines, like fences, only hold until something beautiful and unstoppable decides to walk straight through them. And every night, when the lamps were turned low and the cicadas screamed in the Chinaball trees, more women woke from dreams of river clay skin and eyes like spilled wine, pressed their faces into their pillows, and whispered the name that was already tearing the city into pieces too small to mend. The meeting took place on the second floor of the Atlanta Hotel, above the saloon where the chandeliers were still lit even though it was 2 in the morning. 12 men climbed the narrow stairs single file, none speaking, none looking at one another. They wore blacked out the windows with quilts before they lit the single lamp. When the door was barred from the inside, the only sound was the scrape of chair legs and the thick breathing of men who had never before been afraid of anything they could buy or whip or hang. Judge Whitfield presided, though he looked 20 years older than the men who had raised his cane at the auction block. Beside him sat Ezekiel Rawls, face swollen from drink and sleeplessness, Senator Bullock, whose niece now refused to leave her bed, Colonel Hargrove, whose daughter had tried to drown herself in the horse trough, the banker Lowndes, the cotton factor McKendry, 5 planters whose names appeared on every mortgage in Fulton County, and the Reverend Mr. Pritchard, collar unbuttoned for the first time in 40 years. They laid their pistols on the table like offerings. Rawls spoke first, voice hoarse. "We cannot let the sun come up on that devil still breathing." No one argued. They voted by raising their right hands, one after another, until every palm was in the air. The decision was made without theatrics. Silas Vale would be taken from the Whitfield place before dawn, carried to the woods beyond the railroad cut, and hanged from the tallest oak. No trial, no record, no marker. A quiet necessity, they told themselves, the way a surgeon tells himself amputation is mercy. They chose 30 riders, trusted overseers, a deputy or 2, men who had done this kind of work before and would not talk afterward. Torches, ropes, and a spare horse were waiting behind the livery stable by 4 o'clock. The sky was still black as the inside of a coffin when the posse moved out, hooves muffled with burlap, every man carrying a Navy revolver and a length of new hemp. The Whitfield gate stood open. That should have been the first warning, but rage makes men stupid. They rode up the long drive beneath the water oaks and found the great house lit window to window, lamps burning as though for Christmas. On the wide front gallery, in a perfect line, stood every white woman of the household, Mrs. Whitfield in a wrapper the color of fresh cream, Clara and Louisa in their nightgowns, hair loose down their backs, Miss Letitia holding the judge's double-barreled greener across her forearm like she had been born to it. Behind them, crowded on the steps and clinging to the columns, were at least a dozen more, women from houses all over the city. Some had walked barefoot through the dark. Some had come in carriages that now waited empty beyond the boxwoods. All of them held weapons, squirrel rifles, horse pistols, one ancient fowling piece longer than its owner was tall. The riders pulled up short. Horses shied and snorted, smelling powder before any had been poured. Judge Whitfield appeared in the doorway behind the women, coatless, hair wild, eyes red. He tried to speak, but his wife lifted one hand and he fell silent the way a dog falls silent when its master lifts a finger. Mrs. Whitfield stepped to the edge of the porch. Moonlight slid across the small, undeniable curve beneath her gown. "You will not pass this gallery," she said, calm as reading scripture. "Not while blood still moves in me." Rawls spurred forward, cursing. The greener in Miss Letitia's hands roared. The load of buckshot took the hat off Rawls's head and splintered the column beside his ear. The second barrel stayed steady on his chest. No one else moved. 30 armed men sat their horses in the hush that follows thunder and stared at 20 women who had never fired a gun in their lives until tonight, women whose eyes shone with something brighter and more terrible than courage. Clara Whitfield spoke next, voice soft, almost kind. "If you hang him, you hang all of us with him. We will tie the ropes around our own necks and step off the same branch. Every one." A ripple went through the riders. Some looked away. One or two eased their horses backward a step. The night smelled of gunpowder and jasmine and the coming rain. Somewhere in the dark behind the house, a man began to sing, low, steady, the same wordless tune that had drifted up the back stairs for months. The women on the porch lifted their chins and took it up, a soft chorus that made the skin crawl on every man who heard it. The posse sat frozen, caught between the habit of ownership and the sudden, sick knowledge that ownership had slipped through their fingers like water. Minutes bled away. The east began to pale. No one had reloaded. No one had advanced. The rope coiled on the lead rider's saddle horn stayed coiled. Finally Senator Bullock wheeled his horse so sharply it reared. He spat once into the dust and rode back down the drive without looking behind him. One by one the others followed, some cursing under their breath, some silent, all of them carrying the same stunned expression of men who have discovered too late that the ground beneath their boots is no longer theirs. Behind them the women stayed on the gallery until the last hoofbeat faded and the lamps burned themselves out, rifles still in their hands, bellies rounding beneath cotton and silk, singing that low, sweet, ruinous song into the coming dawn. October 19th, 1850 came in on a cold rain that turned the red clay to blood-colored gumbo and rattled the tin roofs like buckshot. By late afternoon the sky had gone the color of a fresh bruise, and every gutter in Atlanta ran fast and brown. No one could have said exactly when the first flame started. Some swore it was lightning, others that God himself had finally taken a hand. Others whispered that they saw a tall figure moving along the alley behind the Whitfield stables with no lantern, no torch, only the rain steaming where it touched his skin. The fire began in the judge's hay barn and leapt to the carriage house before the first shout went up. By then to the summer kitchen, then to the great house itself. Flames climbed the white columns like lovers who had waited too long. Inside, the women made no effort to save anything. They walked out the front door in their nightgowns, hair unbound, faces luminous in the orange light, and lined the gallery again as though greeting guests. Mrs. Whitfield carried nothing but a small bundle wrapped in a quilt. Clara and Louisa held hands. Miss Letitia still had the greener, but the barrels pointed at the ground now, useless and forgotten. Across the city, other houses began to burn. The Rawls mansion on Ivy Street, the Callaway place on Washington, the Hargrove cottage near the railroad cut, all blooming with fire at almost the same moment. Windows burst outward in glittering showers. Roofs lifted off whole and drifted down the street like burning boats. People ran into the rain with buckets, with blankets, with nothing at all, but the flames only laughed and spread faster. The bell in the courthouse tower clanged itself hoarse and then fell silent when the supports gave way. Silas Vale appeared on Decatur Street just after full dark. He wore no shirt, no shoes, only the same coarse trousers he had been given in April. Rain hissed when it struck his shoulders and turned to steam before it reached his waist. Water ran off him in sheets, yet he was not wet. He walked south toward the depot, slow and barefoot, leaving no prints in the mud. Behind him the horizon glowed the color of molten copper as mansion after mansion surrendered to the fire. Women came to their windows as he passed. Some opened the sashes and leaned out, hair whipping in the hot wind, calling his name in voices that carried over the roar of the flames. Others stood on balconies already sagging with heat and sang that low, rolling song that had haunted Atlanta's dreams for months. A few climbed down porch posts or slipped outside doors and followed him at a distance, barefoot in the mud, skirts plastered to their legs, faces lifted as though walking toward sunrise instead of ruin. No one tried to stop him. The few who stumbled into his path, drunk, armed, wild-eyed, took one look and stepped aside as though an invisible hand had pushed them. One planter raised a pistol, thumb on the hammer, and found he could not pull it the final inch. The barrel drooped until it pointed at his own foot, and he stood weeping in the rain while Silas walked on. By the time he reached the railroad tracks, the city behind him was a furnace. Sparks rose in spirals tall as church steeples. The heat was so fierce it dried the mud on the street and cracked it into plates. Silas paused beneath the depot's overhang where he had first stood in chains 6 months earlier. For a long moment he looked back at the burning hill, at the silhouettes of women still singing from rooftops that would not hold them much longer. Then he turned south again, toward the dark line of the Chattahoochee, and kept walking. The rain followed him like a bridal train, and the fire followed the rain, and Atlanta followed the fire with its eyes until there was nothing left to see but smoke and the faint, lingering scent of crushed mint and moonflowers drifting over the ruins. Behind him, one by one, the great houses folded in on themselves with sighs like lovers finally spent. Beams snapped. Glass melted and ran in silver rivers down the streets. And through the smoke, faint at first, then stronger, rose the sound of women's voices braided together in a final, perfect chord that held every note of grief and triumph the city had ever tried to silence. When the sun came up the next morning, nothing remained of Upper Peachtree but blackened chimneys standing like grave markers in a field of ash. The railroad tracks were warped into ribbons of iron. The only living things moving were crows and a thin column of women walking south in wet, singed nightgowns, bellies heavy, eyes fixed on a horizon already shining with something that was never again owned by anyone in Georgia. And somewhere far ahead, barefoot and unhurried, a man walked on through the pine barrens, humming low, while the rain kept falling and the smell of smoke slowly gave way to river water and wild azalea and the long, sweet promise of country that had not yet learned the taste of chains.